The late 1970s saw a rise in violence from football matches, which led to obviously people not turning up to games anymore. Margaret Thatcher decided that she wanted to use sport as a vehicle to overcome hooliganism. However, in contrast with this, she did decide to boycott the Moscow Olympics, so it meant that a lot of British athletes have decided to pull out of the Olympics. Also, Thatcher in 1981 decided that she wanted to let education authorities sell the school land that they had considered surplus to their requirements. Over the next decade, an estimated 5,000 playing fields were sold. Obviously, this had allowed children to play a lot less, and many were converted into housing developments, supermarkets and car parks. Sport for All came in 1981 though, which acknowledged the growth of facilities which happened through the 70s and looked at increasing it in the 80s. They also identified who weren't participating and why, so minority groups, where they lived, etc., so they could get involved. So in the early 80s, particular groups targeted were such as young black males, ASBOs, anybody that was in gangs, so they were basically trying to pull them off the street to gain something meaningful. Early 80s, sports focused on flourishing athletes. Swimming pools were designed for a minority of people that train their swimmers, rather than majority, which were for social and recreational purposes. Sports Council came in 1982 for a 10-year plan. They demanded more sports centres or upgraded sports centres outside built-up areas, so areas that needed them the most, which obviously ties in with people that they were trying to push in. So obviously young black males and things that couldn't get to sports centres in cities, they were building some more. Access to more leisure time, so obviously giving people a bit more time to do what they wanted. Participation has substantially grown, especially in young men and middle-aged men. Groups in low participation were women and children, part-time and unskilled workers, and over 45 years of age, so they basically started to target these groups as well. Looking at utilising facilities in schools as they didn't get used out of hours, so sports halls, fields in schools, they didn't get used obviously once children had done at school. They also wanted to use it to reduce social inequalities, so everybody had a chance to get involved in some sort of sport, one way or another. 1981 to 1983, over 1,000 sports centres were built due to the demand in the 70s. Minority groups again were targeted for sport participation. Racial clashes were common. This got worse when police were given the go-ahead to stop and search anyone. Black males felt they were constantly targeted. The race clash didn't affect the whole country, as black people were still a big minority throughout the country, and a lot of places had very few black people or none at all. So these again were areas that they targeted to build more sports centres or develop sports centres that they'd already got in play. 1983 general election, in spite of unemployment doubling to some 3 million, government still won a landslide victory as Labour sort of fell to bits. So basically Conservatives stayed in 1983. Welfare state benefits were increasingly subject to means testing as well, so they did obviously start to look at what welfare rights people had and maybe looking at giving them more money, which may have allowed them to get involved in sport and leisure a bit more. Mid-80s, schools were slated for declining competitive sport, so school sport was linked to demise of international standard, so basically not doing very well at Olympics, not doing very well at football and other sport. They did blame schools, basically saying that sport wasn't good enough in schools and that was a knock-on effect. So starting from grassroots, it wasn't good enough. So basically at Olympic level, again, they couldn't just meet demand. In 1986, sport was realised as part of social welfare. So not only was it as part of someone's physical well-being, but also part of social well-being. So people decided it was a social group as well as a sports group. So that obviously swayed people more into getting into sport, so they could have a social life outside of home life. There was radical reshaping of the welfare state, late 80s, to be more means tested, which they did look at earlier on in the decade, but they did sort of look at it even more in 1988, whereas they changed it all so people could have that bit more money and it would allow them more opportunities. In 1988, there was a 5-year review on the Sports Council previous report. Targets set for increased participation and investment set out for facilities and investing in top-level performers were the main two things that came out of that 5-year report. Moving on further into the latter 80s as well, 1986 also saw the creation of International Federation for Persons with Mental Handicap, opening for the first time an international competitive sports pathway for athletes with learning disabilities. So obviously they were not just getting able-bodied athletes involved, but they're also getting people with disabilities involved as well. Youth agencies failed to mention sport in any of their reports though, as they saw sport as lazy youth work and it controlled them. So obviously there were some areas that sport was tapping into now, which mental handicap was one of them. However, youth agencies just didn't agree with it. They agreed with other ways of dealing with youth. They obviously thought sport was a lazy way of dealing with people, and obviously they were using it as a bribe, so they saw it that they were controlling these particular people. In 1988, government, through the then Minister of Sport, Colin Moynihan, conducted a review of the organisation and resourcing of sport for disabled people in the UK, building on ability. The review group's report was published. So this was basically surrounding disabled people and their access to sport. The report contained a wide range of recommendations aimed at all the statutory and voluntary agencies involved, urging them to build on progress made and to focus on creating additional opportunities and closer liaisons and cooperation. The report recognised the important role played by the UK Sports Association to date and role it was likely to play in the future. So obviously they were looking at their future and how they could develop sport, not just for everyday people, but disabled people, people with mental handicaps. So they are looking at developing sport for the future.